June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. Flight deck of the carrier Akagi, 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The tropical sun blazed down on steel that had grown hot enough to blister bare skin. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga stood near the island superstructure, his flight suit still damp with sweat from the morning's bombing run over Midway. In his pocket, an unfinished letter to his wife. Around him, the organized chaos of carrier operations unfolded with practiced precision. Type 99 dive bombers being wheeled across the deck. Type 97 torpedo planes having their torpedoes removed, replaced with 800-kilogram bombs. Fuel hoses snaking across the wooden planking, like steel serpents feeding the aircraft that would soon launch against what intelligence had reported as a single American carrier somewhere to the northeast. The deck crew worked with desperate efficiency, switching ordnance under pressure, transforming anti-ship weapons into land attack bombs. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal, and salt spray. Through it all there was confidence, absolute unshakable confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific for 6 months without meaningful opposition. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, the Indian Ocean, victory after victory. The American Navy was broken, scattered, demoralized. What remained of their carrier force would be destroyed today, and the war would effectively be over. What Lieutenant Tominaga could not know, what none of the 2,200 men aboard Akagi could know, was that American dive bombers were already overhead. In exactly 9 minutes, his ship would be dying. In 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 precious fleet carriers would be transformed into burning steel coffins. The floating airfields that Japanese admirals had mocked as vulnerable, slow, and strategically useless were about to deliver a blow so devastating that it would reverse the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The laughter was about to stop forever. The confidence of the Imperial Japanese Navy in their carrier doctrine was not mere arrogance. It was built on mathematics, on history, on stunning success. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had championed the carrier as the future of naval warfare in the 1930s, he had faced skepticism from battleship admirals who believed massive gun platforms would remain supreme, but Yamamoto understood what others refused to see. Aircraft carriers were not merely floating airfields. They were mobile bases of power projection that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, appear where the enemy did not expect them, and vanish before retaliation could be organized. He had been proven devastatingly correct. On December 7, 1941, when 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft against Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 American battleships while losing only 29 aircraft. The Imperial Navy's confidence seemed mathematically justified. At Pearl Harbor, they achieved a kill ratio that defied belief. In the Philippines, Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed over 100 American planes while losing 7. At Darwin, they obliterated the harbor facilities and destroyed 30 aircraft while losing 2. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was annihilated. The Dutch East Indies fell in weeks. The Japanese carriers that had accomplished these victories were magnificent instruments of war: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Together they carried 248 aircraft manned by the most experienced naval aviators in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, men who had sunk more Allied warships in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all previous wars combined. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, were technological marvels that had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. When American engineers first tested captured Zeros, they initially refused to believe the performance figures. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the maneuverability of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy anything it encountered. The Zero achieved its miraculous performance through revolutionary design philosophy. Every ounce of unnecessary weight stripped away. No armor to protect the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Even radios were sometimes removed to save a few pounds. The result was an aircraft that could fly circles around anything the Allies possessed. But this same philosophy revealed a fundamental difference in how the two navies conceived of warfare. The Japanese built weapons for warriors. The Americans would build weapons for survival. The Japanese emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and acceptance of death. The Americans emphasized systematic efficiency, material superiority, and preservation of life. This philosophical gulf meant that when Japanese admirals examined American carrier doctrine in early 1942, they fundamentally misunderstood what they were seeing. American carriers were larger, yes, but also slower to launch coordinated strikes. American aircraft were heavier, carrying armor and self-sealing tanks that reduced performance. American pilots had far less flight time than their Japanese counterparts. To Japanese naval planners, this appeared to be weakness, an inability to sacrifice the unnecessary for the essential. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned Pearl Harbor, reviewed early intelligence reports on American carrier operations and was dismissive. His analysis, preserved in Japanese defense archives, concluded that American carriers represented a failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. The mathematics seemed to support his assessment. Japanese carriers could launch a 108-plane strike from 4 carriers in 7 minutes, formed up and en route to target in 15 minutes. The Americans required close to an hour to launch a similar-sized strike from 2 carriers, and their aircraft proceeded to the target in widely separated and uncoordinated groups. What the Japanese failed to understand was that American carriers represented not just ships, but an entire industrial civilization's approach to war. Every extra pound of armor, every gallon of self-sealing fuel tank capacity, every hour of additional pilot training represented something the Japanese could not afford, but America possessed in abundance: the capacity to protect its warriors, the industrial might to build aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, the training infrastructure to replace losses, the logistics network to keep fleets supplied thousands of miles from home. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, these differences began to reveal themselves. The Japanese sank the USS Lexington, one of America's largest carriers, while losing only the light carrier Shoho. By traditional metrics, Japan had won. But the hidden cost was catastrophic. Japanese carrier aircraft suffered such heavy losses from American fighters and anti-aircraft fire that one of their fleet carriers, Shokaku, was rendered unavailable for the next operation. Her sister ship Zuikaku was also sidelined while awaiting replacement aircraft and aircrews. Just as importantly, the Americans had damaged Japanese operational capabilities in ways that didn't appear in victory announcements. The elite dive bomber and torpedo plane formations had been devastated by American defensive fire, but Japanese leadership, intoxicated by apparent victory, failed to learn the crucial lesson. American defensive capabilities, radar-guided fighter interception, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire were evolving into a system that could inflict unsustainable casualties even in defeat. The Japanese could win battles but couldn't replace the losses they sustained winning them. America could lose battles and rebuild stronger. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, the Battle of the Coral Sea was celebrated as another triumph. The sinking of Lexington was announced with fanfare. The unavailability of 2 Japanese carriers for the next operation was barely mentioned in internal reports. This pattern of self-deception, minimizing Japanese losses while maximizing enemy casualty, would become endemic. It created an environment where commanders operated under fatally flawed assumptions about relative strength. Admiral Yamamoto understood the danger. When asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in mid-to 1941 about the outcome of a possible war with the United States, Yamamoto had made a prophetic statement. If ordered to fight, he said, he could run wild for the first 6 months or perhaps a year, but he had utterly no confidence for the second and third years. His prediction would be validated with terrible precision. Japan conquered territories across Asia and the Pacific during the first 6 months of the war. Then came Midway. And at Midway, every assumption, every tactical certainty, every confidence that Japanese admirals had built their strategy upon would be incinerated in 11 minutes of American dive bomber attacks. The path to that moment began with American intelligence, specifically with a small group of codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had been working to break the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. By late May 1942, they had achieved enough success to determine that Japan was planning a major operation, but the target was disguised in their intercepts as AF. Rochefort suspected AF meant Midway, but he needed confirmation. In a brilliant deception, he had Midway send an unencoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications referenced AF having water problems. Confirmation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew the date, location, and composition of the Japanese attacking force. He positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, at a location northeast of Midway designated Point Luck. The Japanese sailed toward what they believed would be an ambush of American forces. Instead, they were sailing into one, On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese launched their first strike against Midway with 108 aircraft. The attack encountered fierce resistance. Marine fighters, though flying obsolete aircraft, fought with desperate courage. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft and had 14 heavily damaged. More critically, the strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed at 7 a.m. that a second attack wave would be necessary. This message arrived just as Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, was making the most crucial decision of his career. He had held 93 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. But with Midway still operational in American aircraft from the island attacking his fleet, Nagumo gave the fateful order at 7:15 a.m. Remove the torpedoes, load bombs for land attack. What followed was controlled chaos. Each torpedo had to be removed, returned to storage, replaced with an 800-kilogram bomb using different mounting points and release mechanisms. The process required rolling aircraft to the hangar deck via elevator, making the switch, then returning to the flight deck. To save time, removed torpedoes were stacked in the hangar deck rather than returned to magazines. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as crews simultaneously refueled aircraft, a procedure strictly forbidden but necessary to meet the pressure of imminent launch. Then at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, launched 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems, finally reached its search area and spotted American ships. The initial report was vague. 10 enemy surface ships, bearing and distance provided, but no identification of types. Nagumo continued the rearming while ordering the scout to ascertain ship types. At 7:55 a.m., relief flooded the Japanese bridge. The scout reported 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers. The rearming could continue, but at 8:09 a.m., another message arrived, correcting the previous report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be 1 carrier bringing up the rear. The Japanese bridge erupted in controlled panic. A carrier changed everything. Nagumo immediately suspended the rearming and ordered preparation for immediate ship attack. But the situation had passed the point of no return. Half the aircraft had bombs attached but not fused. Others had torpedoes partially mounted. Some were on the flight deck, others in the hangar. To launch a coordinated strike, all aircraft needed to be armed the same way. The return to anti-ship armament would require at least 45 minutes. Worse, the returning Midway strike force was now approaching the carriers, low on fuel, many damaged, all needed to land immediately. Japanese naval doctrine was absolute. You recover your aircraft first, then launch new strikes. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second fatal decision. Recover the Midway strike force first, then deal with the American carrier. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:17 a.m., all 4 Japanese carriers focused on recovering aircraft. During this time, their decks were packed with planes, fuel hoses were connected, and ordnance was stacked in exposed positions. They were, in naval terminology, in the vulnerable window, that moment when a carrier is most helpless, unable to launch or defend effectively. What the Japanese didn't know was that American carriers had already launched everything they had. Admiral Raymond Spruance on Enterprise had made a calculated gamble at 7:02 a.m. Launch immediately at maximum range without waiting to coordinate a proper strike. His air operations officer protested that many planes wouldn't make it back. Spruance's reply was prophetic. We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their Midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable. The American launch was chaos by Japanese standards. Instead of a coordinated strike package arriving simultaneously, each squadron launched as soon as ready and proceeded independently. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers became separated. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons in wrong directions. Hornets fighters and dive bombers never found the Japanese fleet at all, running out of fuel and returning to base or ditching the ocean. But what appeared to be American incompetence would paradoxically create the conditions for their greatest naval victory. The uncoordinated American attacks meant that Japanese defenders faced wave after wave of threats from different directions at different times, preventing them from ever achieving the coordinated defense or the organized launch they needed. At 9:18 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers through brilliant navigation. 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers without fighter escort attacked the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled. The massacre was absolute and terrible. All 15 Devastators were shot down. 29 or 30 aircrew were killed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, hiding under his seat cushion in the water. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The sacrifice seemed futile, wasted courage against impossible odds. But the attack achieved something crucial that would only be understood in retrospect. The Japanese Zeros descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The carriers were forced into evasive maneuvers, unable to spot aircraft for launch. And most critically, the attention of every Japanese lookout was focused down at the water, not up at the sky. At 9:36 a.m., 14 more torpedo bombers from Enterprise arrived. They too were massacred, losing 10 of 14 without scoring a hit. At 10 a.m., 12 more from Yorktown attacked. They lost 10 of 12, again scoring no hits. 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers destroyed. The Japanese had every reason to feel victorious. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally relaxed. His operations officer reported they could be ready to launch their strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes. All aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were packed with fueled and armed aircraft. Pilots were in cockpits. Engines were warming up. Victory was 30 minutes away. But Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in circles, searching for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Low on fuel, McCluskey made a guess. Follow a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northeast at high speed. That guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their dives from 14,500 feet. The Zeros were at sea level, refueling. The anti-aircraft guns were trained horizontally for torpedo defense. The decks were covered with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance stacked in violation of every safety regulation. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected Akagi's. In his after-action report, he wrote that the carrier was turning into the wind, her deck packed with aircraft. He could see crew running, fuel hoses being dropped, aircraft trying to start engines. They had maybe 60 seconds warning. Not nearly enough. At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. It exploded in the hangar deck among torpedoes and bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against bulkheads. The secondary explosions were catastrophic. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on Kaga. 4 bombs hit the massive carrier in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb struck forward, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his entire staff instantly. Subsequent bombs hit among the packed aircraft on deck. Within minutes, Kaga was an inferno from stem to stern. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost the same moment, targeting Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line down the flight deck. Soryu had a particular vulnerability. She carried extra aviation fuel in tanks along the hangar deck sides to extend aircraft range. These tanks ruptured immediately, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At 10:31 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the American attack was over. In 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning hulks. The mathematics were devastating. The Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft on deck, 40 aircraft in hangars, 50 aircraft aloft with nowhere to land, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock as explosions rocked the ship beneath him. His staff had to physically drag him from the bridge as fire consumed the carrier. On Kaga, with senior officers killed instantly, command devolved to junior personnel trapped below decks by spreading flames. Soryu's captain, Ryosaku Yamamoto, refused to leave his bridge even as fire approached. He was lasting and lashing himself to the helm, determined to go down with his ship. The scene aboard the burning carriers defied description. Induced explosions continued for hours. Each blast sent sheets of steel flying through compartments packed with men. Hundreds died trapped in sealed compartments as bulkheads glowed red with heat. Superheated steam killed instantly. Others suffocated as fire consumed all oxygen. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack and immediately launched counterstrikes against the American carriers. Her aircraft, flown by veterans, managed to hit Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes despite facing prepared defenses. But at 5:03 p.m., 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into another inferno. Admiral Tamen Yamaguchi, who had commanded the counterstrikes, chose to remain aboard. His final message to his staff was brief. "I will apologize to the Emperor for the defeat. You will rebuild the Navy." By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning or sinking. Akagi was scuttled at 5 a.m. on June 5th after burning for 19 hours. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, taking 811 men with her. Soryu went under at 7:13 p.m. with 711 souls. Hiryu lingered until 9 a.m. on June 5th before disappearing beneath the waves with 392 men. The total Japanese death toll was 2,181 sailors, but the true loss was far greater. These weren't just sailors. They were experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines, armorers who could mount torpedoes in minutes, fuel handlers who could conduct underway replenishment, and veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier force, received the reports in silence. His staff officer described the scene. The admiral sat completely still for nearly an hour after learning of the 4th carrier's loss. Then he said quietly, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." Yamamoto understood what others would take months to grasp. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers. In 6 months, they had lost 5. They could build new carriers, but they couldn't replace the trained crews. A carrier pilot required 2 years of training. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling to operate efficiently. The mathematics were inexorable. By the time Japan commissioned 1 new carrier, America would launch 17. The symbolic object that would come to represent American naval dominance was not a weapon but something far more mundane and far more devastating in its implications. Coffee. Hot, fresh coffee available at all hours aboard American carriers. To Japanese sailors subsisting on rice and preserved fish, the idea that American ships could brew fresh coffee continuously, that American sailors drank it casually throughout their watches, represented a level of abundance that seemed impossible. Japanese officers who inspected American carriers after the war were stunned not by the weapons systems, but by the galleys, the food storage, the crew quarters. One Japanese officer, examining the USS Enterprise in 1945, remarked through an interpreter that the enlisted men's mess was better than Japanese officers' quarters. The coffee represented something deeper than mere beverage. It represented an industrial capacity so vast that even in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from home, American forces operated with a level of comfort and abundance that Japan couldn't match even in home waters. Every cup of coffee represented supply chains that worked, logistics networks that delivered, and an economic system that could produce more than enough for its warriors while simultaneously building the weapons to defeat its enemies. American pilot training programs illustrated this abundance in stark terms. By 1943, American pilots entered combat with 300 hours minimum flight time, including 50 hours in their specific aircraft type. They had fired thousands of practice rounds and practice carrier landings until they were automatic. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training, constrained by fuel shortages and aircraft availability, had collapsed. By 1944, Japanese naval pilots entered combat with 200 hours of flight time. By 1945, it had fallen to 40 hours. Kamikaze pilots received only 40 to 50 hours total training, approximately 7 days. They learned to take off and fly straight. They didn't learn to land because they wouldn't need to. The production numbers told the same story. In 1944, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of all types. America produced 35,000 fighters that year alone. Grumman's Bethpage's New York factory produced F-6F Hellcat fighters at a rate of 1 every 60 minutes at peak production. The company manufactured 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. Japan couldn't comprehend this scale. It wasn't just that America could build more. It was that America could build more while simultaneously improving quality, while training more pilots than Japan could produce aircraft, while maintaining supply lines across 2 oceans. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that modern naval warfare would not be determined by warrior spirit or tactical brilliance or individual excellence. It would be determined by intelligence gathering, by industrial capacity, by systematic training, and by the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. The Japanese Navy had been designed and trained for a short, decisive war. A single climactic battle that would shatter enemy morale and force a negotiated peace. Midway was supposed to be that battle. Instead, it revealed that Japan had brought a philosophy suited for the 19th century into conflict with a system designed for total industrial warfare. After Midway, the Japanese Navy instituted new procedures. Combat air patrol maintained at altitude. Decks kept clear unless immediately launching. Ordnance returned to magazines immediately. Multiple search patterns with overlapping coverage. But these changes addressed symptoms, not causes. The cause was that American intelligence, production, and innovation had already surpassed Japan's capacity to compete. The transformation in perception was immediate and permanent. Before Midway, Japanese naval officers believed they were fighting a broken enemy, demoralized by Pearl Harbor, outclassed in training and equipment, led by commanders who didn't understand carrier warfare. After Midway, they knew they were fighting an enemy that had outthought them strategically, outmaneuvered them tactically, and possessed resources they couldn't match. American codebreakers had read their operation orders. American carriers had been waiting in ambush. American dive bombers had achieved approximately 52% hit rates, far above normal statistics, at exactly the perfect moment. Even in apparent defeat, with 35 of 41 torpedo bombers destroyed, the Americans had created the conditions for dive bomber success. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. The myth of invincibility, built over 6 months of unbroken victory, shattered in 11 minutes. Survivors of Midway carried trauma that affected their performance in subsequent battles. What military psychologists would later term decision paralysis under pressure. The confidence that had driven aggressive operations evaporated, replaced by caution and defensive thinking. For Americans, those 11 minutes created the opposite transformation. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized by Pearl Harbor, had discovered it could not just fight the Japanese Navy but destroy it. Admiral Nimitz, receiving confirmation of the victory, told his staff that the Japanese were not supermen. They could be beaten. They had been beaten. Now America would take the offensive. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, put it simply, we had stood up to the best they had and destroyed it. After that, we knew we would win the war. It was just a matter of time and blood. The floating airfields that Japanese admirals had laughed at, mocked as vulnerable and strategically limited, had proven to be the decisive weapons of Pacific warfare. Aircraft carriers were not merely ships. They were mobile manifestations of national industrial power. They could project force across thousands of miles of ocean, appear where unexpected, strike with devastating affect, and withdraw before counterattack could be organized. But more fundamentally, carriers represented competing philosophies of warfare and society itself. Japanese carriers emphasized minimal crews, maximum efficiency, and acceptance of vulnerability in exchange for striking power. American carriers emphasized crew protection, damage control capability, and sustainability of operations. Japanese aircraft sacrificed pilot protection for performance. American aircraft accepted reduced performance to bring pilots home alive. Japanese training created elite warriors. American training created competent professionals in vast numbers. These weren't merely different tactical choices. They represented different answers to the fundamental question of warfare. Does a nation sacrifice its warriors for tactical advantage, or does it protect its warriors even at the cost of immediate capability? Japan chose the former. America chose the latter. And in the crucible of total war, the nation that protected its warriors, that valued their lives enough to wrap them in armor and train them thoroughly and support them with overwhelming logistics, proved capable of sustaining combat operations that the nation emphasizing warrior sacrifice could not match. Admiral Isoroku, who commanded Japanese forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, where Japan lost 3 more carriers and 600 aircraft in what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We laughed at American carriers because we didn't understand they represented not just ships but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our naval aviation had ceased to exist. The laughter had stopped at Midway. It never resumed. In the 43 months of war that followed Midway, Japan would commission 6 new fleet carriers. America would commission 91 fleet and light carriers. Japanese pilot quality declined continuously as casualties mounted and training time contracted. American pilot quality improved continuously as training programs expanded and combat lessons were incorporated. By 1945, Japanese carriers sat in port unable to operate because they had no trained pilots. American carriers operated continuously off the Japanese coast, their aircraft destroying what remained of Japanese industry and military capability. The wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers today lie in waters over 17,000 feet deep, protected within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. They are war graves for thousands, testimonies to 11 minutes that changed the trajectory of history. Oceanographic expeditions have surveyed these wrecks, documenting how they rest on the ocean floor. Akagi sits upright, her flight deck collapsed into the hangar. Kaga rests inverted, her massive hull broken by the explosions that consumed her. Soryu lies scattered across a debris field, testament to the violence of her destruction. These ships, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, the instruments of Pacific conquest, the symbols of Japanese naval power, now rest in eternal darkness as monuments to the moment when confidence met reality, when tactical brilliance encountered systematic superiority, when warrior tradition faced industrial capacity. The legacy of those 11 minutes at Midway extends far beyond the specific battle. Modern military strategists still study the engagement for lessons applicable to contemporary conflict. Information dominance remains decisive. First strike advantage and high. Technology warfare usually determines outcomes. All military systems have moments of maximum vulnerability. Individual decisions under pressure still determine results. Better systems defeat better warriors. The floating airfields, mocked and dismissed by Japanese admirals in the confident spring of 1942, had demonstrated something profound about the nature of modern warfare and the societies that wage it. Naval power in the industrial age would not be determined by the quality of individual warriors, or the tactical brilliance of commanders, or the spiritual strength of fighting men. It would be determined by which nation could build more ships, train more pilots, sustain more losses, and continue fighting. Which nation valued its warriors enough to protect them, trusted its systems enough to decentralize decision-making, and possessed the industrial abundance to support military operations thousands of miles from home with fresh coffee and hot food and spare parts and replacement aircraft. The waves of hell that descended from the sky above the Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, were not merely American dive bombers delivering 1,000-pound bombs. They were the physical manifestation of a democratic industrial society's capacity to mobilize, organize, produce, and sustain warfare on a scale that authoritarian efficiency could not match. Every bomb that fell represented factories that had been retooled, workers who had been trained, resources that had been allocated, and a nation that had decided the war would be won regardless of cost. The Japanese admirals stopped laughing when the first bomb hit Akagi's flight deck. By the time the last carrier slipped beneath the waves, they understood they had never been fighting merely the United States Navy. They had been fighting American abundance, American industrial capacity, American systematic training, American technical innovation, and American willingness to protect its warriors even at the cost of immediate tactical advantage. Against that combination, warrior spirit and tactical excellence and individual brilliance were not enough. They had never been enough. The floating airfields had proven that modern warfare would be won by the nation that could build the better system, not the nation that could produce better warriors. And in 11 minutes of fire and destruction above the endless blue Pacific, that truth descended from the sky like judgment itself.